Hello, hopefully, I think we're live. Hopefully everyone's joined us. There might be a few stragglers, but we are here from Freeths to talk to you today about the incredibly lengthy title, Mandatory COVID-19 Vaccines in Care Settings, Actions Care Homes Should Be Taking. And I think we could add a now onto the end of that as well, because we're going to be talking about very much what's expected, but also what steps homes should be taking now to prepare for November and everything they should be doing in the meantime. We are recording this session. I don't think anybody else apart from the people on the screen now are going to have access to joining us on the screen, but just do be aware, and we're going to be monitoring a chat box and questions box throughout as well. I just want to start by introducing you to our speakers, and I'm going to go through my screen, so I'm not choosing anyone in particular, but starting off with Dan McNally, who's a Freeths member of staff and is in our sort of regulatory team, and I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about that later as well. Next we have Tom Draper in our Sheffield office in the employment team, Luke Dixon in our data protection team. And we are also joined by Bhavna Keane-Rao, who is not with Freeths, a friend of Freeths, I think we can officially say, and the managing director of BKRCC, who I'm assured is one of the largest independent care consultancies in the UK. And although you couldn't tell from this screen, I'm sure, we're not in HD, Bhavna has over 23 years experience working with the CQC, incredibly. So, she's here to impart her wisdom as we go through this as well. In many ways, I think as well, speaking up on behalf of so many of the people who are joining us from across the care sector. I should say, my name is Kevin Poulter. I'm an employment partner at Freeths, so I'll be helping Tom out with some of these tricky questions that we've already got and we have lined up. So we'll deal with some questions at the end. Some people have already submitted some questions, so thank you for that. But let's kick off. Well, the regulations are here. We maybe didn't expect them to be as imminent. But they are. They're a little bit further and a bit more extensive than even I think the consultation suggested. But they're here and they're going to come into effect on the 11th of November. Incredibly not that far away, although we're still waiting for the summer. We've also seen some operational guidance now published, which came on the 4th of August, I think, so a couple of weeks ago. And that's really sort of the premise of a lot of what we're going to be talking about now. We also recognise there are still some gaps in there, which we'll try and sort of fudge as best as we can on the government's behalf. As expected by the time of the consultation, the government wants this mandatory vaccine in place ahead of, I suppose, the winter sort of rush on flu potentially, now that people are out and about a lot more, so the other expected seasonal problems. And presumably to help out the NHS as we've done throughout. So the clock is ticking on all of us, and especially ticking now, I think, on the members of staff, the people that you're working with who will need to be vaccinated ahead of that November deadline. So we're looking today at sort of giving you some background, a little bit of insight into the guidance itself, but primarily what we want to get across to you is as much as possible some practical guidance and practical advice that you can start to take away now to think about in your own settings. There is unfortunately, in some instances, no one size fits all, and it will, as we go through this, be undoubtedly down to a lot of commercial sort of inputs and sort of your own sort of scenario planning. So enough from me for the moment. Let's kick off with one of the questions we've already had, which is quite simply, what are the requirements under the new regulations and which care homes are in scope? So our resident experts on these issues is Tom Draper today. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. What the regulations say is that all CQC regulated care homes in England providing accommodation for individuals who need nursing or personal care to allow entry to the premises only to those who can evidence that they have received a complete course of an authorised COVID-19 vaccine unless they are exempt. So what does that mean for us in practice? Well, let's break it down and first of all decide who this new regulation applies to. So if you're thinking about that question, the first part of the explanation there, and the law and the regulations say that it applies to CQC regulated care homes. So if you're not CQC regulated, then this new regulation does not apply to you. Secondly, it applies to care homes in England. So the regulations do not apply in Scotland and Wales, and there are different considerations there, especially for national care providers who may have care homes across various different nations of the UK. But we are today concerned with these particular regulations that apply to care homes in England. The next part of the definition is that they provide accommodation for individuals who need nursing or personal care. So nursing or personal care is also a requirement of the regulations, and for them to apply to your particular care home. So that's who we're talking about. And then the second question is, what do the regulations mean? Well, what do they require us to do if we fall into that part of the definition? And the answer is, we're only able to provide access to those premises to people who can evidence that they've received a complete course of an authorised COVID-19 vaccination. And that begs the question, what is an authorised COVID-19 vaccination? And there is some specific guidance around that, but it's the kind of vaccinations you would imagine in terms of AstraZeneca and Pfizer. And then there are various exceptions to the law, and I think we've got a question on that specifically coming up in a minute. But I think the final thing to say is that this doesn't just apply to employees. That most of the focus of today's session will be around employees, but it does also apply, subject to specific exceptions, to anybody visiting a care home. And that might be people who are providing professional services, physiotherapy, hairdressing, who are coming to do maintenance and so forth on your premises. So it's not just a case that you have to think about whether your employees are vaccinated. You also have to think about whether your visitors are vaccinated as well. So that's a summary of the law, who it applies to, and what care providers are going to have to start thinking about when they're applying these regulations.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. You mentioned briefly there in passing about exemptions, and it's really not especially helpful at the moment. So the guidance, the operational guidance, does refer to some exemptions, and explicitly medical exemptions or clinical exemptions on for clinical reasons. And it refers over to sort of a number of other policies as well, none of which are particularly helpful on this point. And so I won't go into too much detail because we just don't have that detail at the moment about what will constitute an acceptable or an eligible exemption. But one thing that I just want to pick up on that, though, and we will talk about this a little bit more later, is about sort of the evidence. How do you evidence what a medical exemption might be? And again, it's expected that there may be some more direction around this in the coming, hopefully, the coming weeks, if not days. But if not, it's really going to be down to sort of an individual assessment. And how you go about doing that is going to trigger potentially a whole number of other issues as well. So if somebody comes to you and says, well, I don't need to get the vaccine, I have an exemption, I have a clinical exception here. Well, first of all, you need to know a little bit more about it to be able to justify it justify the exception under these guidance themselves. So you need to get a little bit more information. How much information you need? Well, you could seek sort of information from a GP, somebody obviously who's got first-hand experience. Whether there's potential to have an independent assessment, whether that's even necessary, is possibly on a case-by-case basis. but certainly taking somebody's word for it is probably not going to be sufficient to satisfy these guidelines. And of course, once you have that information, there's a whole load of potential issues that come along with that. I'm just going to bring in for a moment Luke, and this is just talking specifically about sort of the medical data. But when people are registering exemptions, exceptions to these guidelines and this guidance, what sort of information should they be requesting, and actually how should they be storing it, maintaining it, and handling it?
Thanks very much, Kevin. I think when it comes to sort of, I'll sort of treat it as sort of COVID status data in general, and we can approach all this kind of thing, and whether you've had the vaccine or not, etc., on that basis. Basically, the regulator in this case for data protection is the Information Commissioner's Office, and it has issued guidance regarding COVID, how to process COVID status data. And basically it says that unless you're just viewing it visually, if you are recording it digitally, etc., and collecting it in some kind of fixed form, you will be processing personal data. What is more, the COVID status data of these persons, the data subjects, is likely to be special category data because it's effectively health data, their health data or medical data, as you say. And that sort of brings in additional considerations because special category data attracts additional protections under the UK GDPR. So one of the things that really is brought out in the ICO guidance you need to think about when you're recording or processing the data is to be very clear about why you are collecting and processing the data. Don't do it on a just in case or it might be helpful basis. Make sure you've got a reason for doing it, and that you actually need to do that, and that you're prepared to be transparent about it too. So the next thing that the ICO talks about is transparency. And that's basically telling people why you're collecting, what you're doing with it, how are you going to share it, if you are going to share it, your lawful basis for collecting and processing it as well. And in terms of a practical point, you can carry out your transparency obligation by providing a privacy notice to the individuals whose data you are collecting. So that's something else to think about. I mentioned just now a lawful basis, so and that's another very key point. So the UK GDPR requires you to have a lawful basis for your processing of personal data. So you will need to have at least one. In fact, in special category data like this stuff, you'll need 2 grounds for processing the data. And the ICO guidance is reasonably helpful. It sort of throws about 1 or 2 ideas that you might be able to use. I think primarily, you'd be able to use legitimate interests in order to sort of maintain a sort of healthy or safe workplace, for instance, or environment, protecting people as your primary ground. But because you'll be collecting and processing health data, you'll need an additional special condition on top of that. And I think probably for employees, you're probably looking at things like employment rights and obligations, that sort of field, that ground, possibly public health. Where you've actually got people who are non-employees, you might be seeking to rely possibly on their explicit consent, or again, public health grounds as well for processing that. So talking practically about the kind of things that people should be doing. We mentioned privacy notices. You should provide those in advance up front so people know how you're going to be processing their data, and those notices need to be clear and concise and transparent, cover all the main bases as well, so the kind of things we spoke about, but also for instance, who you may be sharing the data with, in case regulatory bodies want to see that data as well. And furthermore, other things to consider operationally are it's always quite a good idea, I think, or maybe required, depending on if there's a high risk to your processing, to do what we call a data protection impact assessment. And that's basically a document that you can fill in, complete, which sort of assesses the potential risks you're processing and the mitigating factors and manage them down. And then you can record that and show it to the regulator if there's ever an issue. Again, we mentioned putting notices in place. Keep the data secure. Very important. This stuff is sensitive. Keep the data secure. Use appropriate security measures. Don't keep the data for any longer than you reasonably need it or required to keep it. So we've got the storage limitation principle here. Don't keep or collect any more data than you require in this situation about their COVID status. and whatever you do, don't change the purposes for collecting and processing the data. So don't collect it because you're required to, for instance, in this situation, your legitimate interest, whatever, and then say, oh, actually, we'd also like to keep it for another reason over here we haven't told people about it, we have no lawful basis for. That would be very problematic from a GDPR perspective.
Thanks, Luke. And I'm just going to come back to you in a second, because one of the things that is being questioned is, okay, well, we're talking about 2 vaccines now, 2 doses, but there's already talk about, there has been for a while, about boosters, and whether they're actually not covered by the guidelines as they currently are, the operational guidance at least. But I think the suggestion is there's an encouragement that people will have boosters as and when required. And when you're talking about the privacy notice, is it possible to have something which not only covers data that you're collecting now, but also data you may collect in the future as well? Or would you need to issue a new privacy notice at each stage that new information is collected?
I think best practice would be to update the privacy notices according to the new data you're going to collect. Certainly the ICO requires the data privacy notices to be accurate, so as they're not misleading, and as I said, they need to be quite clear and transparent. So quite often, if you say we may do this, we may do not, that's not actually being very sort of clear with the data subjects. It could, in the worst cases, be misleading and therefore sort of breach UK GDPR. So I think stick as closely to what you are definitely going to do for those transparency and fairness reasons. I think it's possible.
Yeah. Thank you. And we're not going to say this to the end, we're going to deal with it now, but what are the potential consequences if you don't comply with this guidance, if you don't comply with the mandatory vaccine requirement? I'm going to bring in Dan now, who I think is going to be the sort of the bearer of the bad news, and sort of the stick that people are going to be beaten with if indeed there are any problems. So Dan, let you take over from there.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I mean, put simply, if providers don't comply with this new requirement, then by the strict letter of the law, they will be in breach of Regulation 12, which requires all providers to provide safe care and treatment to their service users. And on any such finding, there are both criminal and/or civil penalties for a breach. On the criminal side, these range from a formal caution through to a criminal prosecution and the prospect of an unlimited fine on conviction. On the civil side, the penalties range from a warning notice through to a notice to either vary, or a proposal rather, to vary, suspend, or indeed remove registration altogether. So the consequences are undoubtedly severe and significant, and it seems to me there are 2 important points to note going forward here. Firstly, even if providers are deemed to be in breach of Regulation 12, the law does afford them a statutory defence in criminal proceedings if they can demonstrate that they have taken all reasonable steps and acted with all due diligence to avoid the breach. And therefore, it's absolutely imperative that providers undertake risk assessments and keep appropriate written records of any training, vaccination records, of course, that relate to staff and non-staff, and any other documentation, so that they can evidence to the CQC when asked that they have, as I say, undertaken reasonable steps and acted with all due diligence. And then secondly, the operational guidance and the law, it's clear that there is likely to be further changes going forward. So providers need to be aware of that. The operational guidance indicates as much. So, for instance, as the vaccine continues to be rolled out, those under 18 may eventually be removed from the exemptions list. So providers can't afford to be caught out by that. So they need to have in place, as part of their procedures, they need to check the legislation and guidance. They need to check that and make sure that it's not being changed or further amended going forward.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously, just generally speaking, around any sort of workplace or any place where people are visiting, there's obviously the overriding health and safety requirements, and to provide safe places of work and the like. Presumably, there's an even greater because of commercial as well as sort of stick here to compel care homes to take extra care to ensure that these things are happening. And I'm going to start with you, Dan, but just I suppose, what advice would you have for anybody that's considering, well, you know, we've still got sort of 5% of our employees who are not going to be vaccinated, but it's 5%. The chances of getting caught out on that's probably quite low. What sort of advice would you have for them?
Well, commercially, they can't afford to take that risk, quite simply. CQC have made it absolutely clear that they are going to be checking this as part of their inspections. And if providers are found wanting, that will, putting aside any potential criminal or civil sanction, it will have an adverse impact on their rating. It will be treated as a breach of the regulations, and at the very best, the highest rating that a provider could expect is one of requires improvement. So there are, as I say, other than the criminal and civil sanctions, you know, there are potentially significant commercials. There's the potential for significant commercial consequences as well.
Thanks. And I just want to, before we move on to sort of the implementation aspects of it, Bhavna, I don't know if you're able to come in and join us for a second and just to talk about sort of your experiences sort of within care homes at the moment, because you're visiting a number of different providers, and how are they sort of responding to this? What's the expectation? Are people now sort of pushing hard towards getting the sort of the vaccines? And I suppose to a certain extent, how are they doing that?
Well, initially, I think everyone thought, okay, we'll do it gently. And suddenly it came to light that the deadlines were looming. So some of the providers have been proactive and actually put together a quick, very basic policy. So long as you've got something on piece of paper, I'm surrounded by lawyers, I have to say that, don't I? So they've got something in paper that says, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to, and this is how we're going to monitor. So it covers all the angles. It's not very pretty policy. It's not absolutely wonderful, but it'll do for the time being. The other thing that I think people are doing is trying to do, and I always said, you know, it's the stick and the carrot approach. And they are really desperately trying to engage with staff. They're having one-to-ones, they're having discussions, they're having peer group discussions, individuals, trying to encourage people to say, actually, we've got to get these vaccinations. You've got to start having it. But then now the reality is dawning that there are going to be people who are going to leave care sector. And I think that's where we're at. People have got trackers in place to track how many people are vaccinated. So everything that's basic, everything, the tools that care homes have, they're adapting them. And I think that's the easiest and simplest way they're doing it. And I don't think you need to recreate that in any of the care settings. You've got the tools, tweak them. Use what you have, implement it, just give your time to your staff because the staff need it at this moment. Because the other side is, and I digress slightly, but the other side is we've had all of these staff who've worked like Trojans, you know, they've really worked hard over the last 12 months. And now we're saying, if you don't get vaccinated, we're going to sack you. And it's as simple as that. And I think reality is now kicking in. So people are getting upset, frustrated, and then they've got a couple of weeks where they think, okay, we're going to have to do it or leave the care sector or the care home, because of course they can always go and work in domiciliary care agency. So we may lose a lot of our staff who may go to domiciliary care agency and work there. How are we going to control that? So it worries me. I think there are a number of issues. I think we've just got to try and get through this. And I don't think the government legislation has helped much to providers. So I think we have to be the leaders in our sector yet again.
Yeah, and the reality is that we don't have a choice over this. It's not something that we're sort of homes are electing to do. We've got no option, and I think it's that message which is really important. So, Tom, if I can bring you in as well now, just to talk about really what care homes should be considering now, what they need to be considering, what should they even be doing to prepare for the 11th of November?
Yeah, it's not just the 11th of November either, is it? Because the 11th of November is when the law comes into place, but people are going to have both vaccinations by the 11th of November in order to be admitted to the premises. So if people are completely unvaccinated at the moment, then there's a lead-in time, and so you've got to start to communicate this with your employees right now, because if they haven't had the first vaccination by the 16th of September, then they're potentially not going to be in a position to have the second vaccine by the 11th of November. And so there really is very little time to start getting that message across. So the earlier you start doing it with your employees, the better. And certainly the clients that I've been working with have already started that process now. It's initially about awareness raising. It's about an explanation of the law, so this doesn't catch people by surprise. And it's about encouragement, and it's about education at this stage. But if that isn't working and you're getting closer and closer to the deadline, then you're going to start to need to have a more of a formal approach. And potentially people are going to have to be dismissed. And Bhavna's exactly right. People are going to potentially leave the care sector. And these are people who've worked very hard in very extraordinary circumstances over the last 12 months. And so these are very difficult conversations that employers are having right now. But to a certain extent, when we at Freeths did the consultation roundtable event, the message that we were getting from clients was very much that we don't think that this law is necessary. And we might actually decide to take this approach, or we might not. But actually that decision's now been taken out of our hands. So to a certain extent, clients can blame the government. They can say, well, look, this law is coming down the track and we don't have a choice about whether or not to implement it. And so we've got to get on with it. And to a certain extent, hopefully that takes some of the sting out of these conversations. But in answer to your question about preparation, needs to start happening now. The awareness raising needs to be in place, and the messaging can't be sugar-coated, unfortunately. The top and bottom of it is, after the 11th of November, if employees are not fully vaccinated, they're not going to be allowed into care homes. So that's what employers should be doing now. I don't know, Kevin, do you want me to go into more detail about the consultation process and the ins and outs of that, if there are still vaccine hesitant employees after this initial approach?
Well, let's leave that for a little moment, because I think then we're talking about really sort of enforcing this this policy, this law, and how we deal with it. I think first of all, I want to come back to Bhavna just to talk about. You talked about having sort of these sort of peer groups, people getting together, and we've seen, particularly in the US, but also over here now, that there's also sort of incentives happening, particularly for younger people in the UK, about sort of having those vaccines, regardless of where they're working and what they're doing. But how are care homes dealing with this? Are people getting sort of lollipops for going down to the vaccine centre, or is there something else that's available?
Well, we've actually started. It's really weird. A couple of days ago, we actually had a Quality Street taken around, because one of the homes we're working in, everyone's been vaccinated now. So we shared out sweets and chocolates. Of course, we were careful with people with diabetes and so on and so forth, and chokers, but please. But, you know, the whole lot, we were able to do that and celebrate, and then share that just to ensure that people are aware. In other places, we've had to do something more creative, incentives such as a voucher. So if everyone gets it done, they get a £20 voucher. There was a discussion about, should we have a lucky dip? So everyone who's been vaccinated thus far, their names go in a hat, and we give them a £200 voucher for Marks and Spencer, or whatever it is. And that worked. It's just the few young women are the ones that we are really struggling with. And there's a couple who are very active in human rights, who are also coming back to us on that one. So it's trying to be as creative as we can to see if we can support, to see if we can provide more information, etc. And that's what we've been doing. If it works, wonderful.
Thank you, thank you. And I suppose just I'm going to follow up if I may, which
No,
is
please.
I'm hearing this from various places as well, but the incentives are great, and I absolutely sort of agree with the principle behind them. What also happens though is that there are people who've been the first in the line, they've been sort of, we're prepared to get the vaccine, to be able to do our work, to protect people around us, to protect ourselves. Is there a sort of an imbalance, perhaps, a bit of an annoyance?
You know, it's always the case though, isn't it? The people that comply, it's like I often used to get, when I was part of CQC, I used to often get people saying, if we're really, really good, you will never come back and see us. And it's not fair. You're punishing the good. And I am so aware of that. But, you know, we're caught in this position where we are trying to celebrate. And that was the reason with the chocolates and some little bits and pieces, you try and engage the whole staff group. And yes, we are potentially rewarding the stragglers, aren't we? And saying, come on, get it done. It's horrible. What do you do, though? It's human nature. We're up against it. You don't want to lose your staff because we've got a huge staff shortage at the moment in the care sector. We really have. So what do? You're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
No, again, no criticism from me. It's just no. I'm curious to know how people will manage it, and sort of, again,
you know, peer group really work. I'll be honest, I cut across. Sorry, peer group pressure really does work. So what we've done is have clusters, and we've said to the little groups, you know, you can do. So another care home we were involved in, we've just had seniors engage with their groups, so 2-3 people, and if they get everyone vaccinated, so even if you've already been vaccinated and you're part of that hub, then we give you vouchers for shopping voucher or whatever it is, and that's worked really well.
So that's treating it like a group reward rather than an individual sort of incentive. That's a good idea.
It really works. It really does work because people listen to your, so if there's a group of us working together, I'm more likely to listen to my peers, people I work with day in, day out, than my manager.
I like it. I like it. Now, let me move on, because one of the things that we obviously need to do, and we've touched on this already, but I want to come back to Luke to talk to him about sort of how do we, it's not just about recording and sort of the monitoring of the vaccine status, it's about actually how do we check it? And there are various sort of permissible ways of doing that. But Luke, can you just tell us a little bit more, if you've got that information, about what's acceptable as notification, as identification of sort of the double vaccine?
Well, I think you know, in this area, as far as the ICO and the UK GDPR and data protection would be concerned, I mean, the processing would really just have to meet the general principles of GDPR. And it have to just, you know, be a question of being transparent and fair in terms of whatever you're doing with whatever form of processing. So I think actually a lot of the considerations here will be similar to the ones that I sort of raised at the start. So to the extent that you are sort of doing this sort of checking, you should make people aware that you will be doing this sort of thing for the purpose for which you're doing it, the lawful basis for which you're doing it, and record this as well. And you know, again, this is the kind of thing you might want to factor into a data protection impact assessment at the outset and say, why this is what we're doing, why we're doing it, what are the risks of doing it, how do we mitigate and push down those risks to make them acceptable, and to make sure that we protect sort of the privacy rights on the other hand of the individuals, you know, and also consider, you know, what is your lawful basis for doing this, you know, your purpose and your lawful basis. You can select those and you can record those, and then, you know, you're in a better position.
Thank you. And actually, what I was thinking about a little bit more was, but I'll answer this for you. It was about the evidence of it. So, for example, what's recommended in the guidance is the NHS app. So people now have this of the vaccine passports, which I think is that we were told we weren't going to have, but we've now got in the NHS app. The NHS website as well. There's an NHS COVID pass letter which is available, and it says, interestingly, according to the guidance at least, that the NHS appointment card cannot be used as proof of vaccination status. And I think that's a really important message for people to take away, that I think in a lot of venues now it's accepted that you've got your little bit of paper and with these stamps on, and that's okay. For these purposes, explicitly not, and I think that's maybe even quite surprising. So I think the key issue, I think, for most people is going to be going through that NHS app or some other sort of form of NHS sort of service or evidence. So
yeah,
thank
and
you.
I think sorry, Karen. I think where the things like the app consideration. I mean, I think probably GDPR is pretty agnostic as to the form of which this evidence takes. Actually, it's really what you do with it and what the evidence is being processed. So you've got the app, for instance. There will be the privacy notice information, etc. All this kind of thing I'm talking about there. So if you're a data subject and you have concerns, but you are provided the evidence via the app, then hopefully that will provide some kind of reassurance.
Yeah, thank you. And Tom, for a moment, I'm just going to. You almost jumped ahead of the game earlier by saying, "Well, what do we do about those people who can't be persuaded?" And I think now's your moment to shine. What do care homes do? What do organisations do if there's those people who are just resistant, who won't have the vaccine, don't have an exemption, of course? What can we do? Can we just get rid of them come November the 11th?
Let's go back to the basics of unfair dismissal law. So with employees who've got more than 2 years service, the first thing we need as employers, if we're looking to terminate their employment, is a potentially fair reason. So most of people who work in HR will be aware of the main 3 potentially fair reasons: incapability, misconduct, and redundancy. And here, none of those 3 apply. We're actually looking at the other 2, which we don't, as employment lawyers, talk about very much. So we're talking about illegality and some other substantial reason, or SOSR for short. So illegality, it is actually going, if we can't redeploy these employees in another part of the business that doesn't require them to attend the premises, then it's going to actually be unlawful for us to employ them. And so potentially we could use illegality as a potentially fair reason, and also then some other substantial reason. So that would cover this kind of situation as well. So once we've identified our potentially fair reason, we then need to follow a fair procedure. And so that would involve early explanation that the employee's employment could be terminated. It would involve meetings with the employee at which they have the right to be accompanied by a trade union representative or a work colleague, listening to their concerns, trying to allay their fears, and looking at alternatives to dismissal, such as redeployment. But if ultimately, once you've had those meetings with the employee and you've done those on a formal basis, you've recorded notes and minutes of those meetings, and the outcome of the consultation is that the employee is still refusing to have the vaccine, then ultimately the answer to your question, Kevin, is yes, you can fairly terminate their employment. And because you're doing a fair process, you would then want to offer them the right of appeal, and get someone else within your organisation to have a look at the fairness of the process, whether we've got that potentially fair reason, and then hold an appeal meeting with them, again, the right to be accompanied, and then deliver a written outcome to both the initial process and also any appeal.
And I'm going to pick up on that point about an appeal, which might be a good excuse to talk about something different, which is, what about those people who have had their first vaccine? Obviously, that doesn't count for the purposes of the rules. There has to be 2 vaccines, and but they've left it too late. They say they couldn't get an appointment. I don't know, whatever it might be, and they appeal on the basis that, well, actually, by the time we've heard the appeal, I will be double vaccinated. Or even those people who've, again, left it too late and won't have both vaccines by the 11th of November. What's the position there? What's the suggestion?
Well, I think this goes to underline the answer to one of your earlier questions, Kevin, which is start talking to people about this now. We can't leave this so that this becomes a surprise. And if the earlier we're talking to people about it, the less of an excuse that they're going to have when it comes to the formal process and saying, oh, well, I didn't realise and I've left it too late. So if you do find yourself in that position, then arguably people should be reinstated on appeal, because that potentially fair reason has at that point evaporated. And so then there is an argument that people should be reinstated if they are then able to evidence the fact that they are fully vaccinated. Yes. I suppose a follow-up question would be, would you pay them? Would you?
Well, you beat me to it, Tom.
So I'm going to ask you that question, Kevin. Would you advise employers to pay people if they have left it too late and they're going through the appeal process?
Well, very good question. Thank you for setting the tables. It's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think that comes back to Bhavna's point in many ways, that it depends what we're trying to achieve here. If we're trying to obviously sort of encourage, incentivize, then the message has got to be, if you're not vaccinated by this time, well, you're not eligible to work. You're not able to provide your services of work, therefore you're not eligible to be paid for that work. It's not us turning you away, you're just not in a position to do it. And on that basis, you would say, well, no, there is no entitlement to be paid if you're not fit and able and ready for work. That's the first point. The second point is Bhavna's point, which is we're desperate for people to work. And if one of the ways of keeping people sort of in work is to stretch it out for an extra 2 weeks, not allow them to work because that would be unlawful, but to say, well, look, if you're vaccinated within 2 weeks, we'll bring you back. Maybe the cost of that 2 weeks of paid leave, effectively, would be less than going through an agency, going through other recruitment methods. And there's a commercial reason for doing so. I'm not suggesting that you have to, but I think there's probably a good reason to do so, given the circumstances that we're in right now. It probably depends on sort of a case-by-case basis as well, how you want to deal with people.
Wouldn't getting them to take some annual leave be another alternative as well?
Well, it would. It would. Thank you for answering your own question. Yeah, take some annual leave, absolutely, or any other type of leave. But there's ways of dealing with it, but it's back to what can we do now, and we need to try and get ahead of this. We don't want to leave this until sort of the first week of November and then start thinking about it. We have to think about sort of what the outcomes might be in November. Think about them now, and certainly ahead of the 16th of September. For those people, and there might be other people as well who have just left it a little bit longer. They want to leave longer, or they have left it longer between the first and the second vaccine. And I know people sort of professionally and sort of personally who've had the first vaccine but haven't had the second and don't have any intention to. So just because they've had one before the 16th of September doesn't actually mean that they're automatically going to get a second one. So it's that encouragement. It's back to sort of that transparency. It's about giving people a reason and sort of incentivizing it that way, and maybe using Bhavna's stick approach rather than the carrot this time. And moving on, if I may, because I'm conscious of time, back to, I think, Dan to start with, around the CQC, really. How you've mentioned that they've said they will investigate these things. How do you think they're going to go about investigating it, and how realistic do you think that threat is?
Well, they'll look at this as part of their routine inspections, as they've already indicated. And if they identify breaches or a breach of Regulation 12, then they will deal with it in a proportionate way, just like they would a breach of any other regulation. That is what is clear from their own guidance. Of course, they won't want to unnecessarily punish providers. I'm sure they'll be well aware of the sensitivities and the precarious position that many are in at the minute due to staffing resources. We all know that staffing resources, that is an issue and has been an issue for some time. And the introduction of this legislation is potentially going to have an adverse impact on that even further. So CQC will be aware of that, and in terms of how they will enforce it, they will not be looking at more extreme sanctions, such as a criminal prosecution or a notice of proposal to remove registration altogether, for instance, unless there is clear evidence that a provider has blatantly disregarded this legal requirement, and or that has resulted in significant consequences for a service user or users. So So yeah, that's how they will approach it. They'll look at this as part of their existing inspection regime, and that's why I say it's important that providers are able to evidence that they've undertaken a risk assessment, that they've introduced specific policies and procedures that deal with this legal requirement. Because as we know, and I'm sure Bhavna will back me up here, if CQC don't see evidence of something, their assumption is it hasn't happened.
Well, a good chance to bring Bhavna in there.
I was desperate to jump in there. Could you tell? For us, it's actually linking it back to your business contingency plan and continuity and sustainability. Record it in any which format that you can and link it with existing systems that you have in place. But risk assessments are critical. I genuinely think there's more of a risk if you can't get staff to provide care. Then what do you do with those residents, your service users? So there is a significant risk, even if it's somebody with one vaccination waiting for another, whatever it is, that risk assessment comes in really, I think it's critical. And I think CQC, I was on a call with the deputy chief inspector for CQC a couple of days ago, and that was my discussion. What is it that what can you do? You're not going to come in with a stick. That's not unfair. That's unfair, unreasonable, and you're not supporting the sector. The sector's already on its knees when it comes to trying to get us back on track. The press negativity, all of those things. We don't want providers sacking people after they've worked the whole year. Can you imagine the press headlines? So we really need to think about that. And I don't think CQC will want to jump into that muddy waters, to be honest. Would you agree, Dan?
Absolutely, Bhavna, I agree.
Yeah, thank you. And well, look, I'm going to take some questions now that have been submitted, but I just want to talk first of all for a little moment about, I suppose, really where we are with this. And at the moment, sort of nationally at least, we're talking, I think, about just 90% of adults have had their first vaccine. With I think 77% now having had their second one. It's interesting there's an impact statement being produced already to sort of anticipate what the figures are going to be like. And it's, I don't know if you've had a look at it, but it's quite alarming to estimate that 7% of the workforce may be unvaccinated by the end of the grace period. So the 11th of November, which is about 40,000 workers. Also suggests the costs of replacing workers, and this is worth factoring in, as we talked about earlier, about sort of giving people some leave to take that vaccine, the second vaccine. The requirement's about £2,500 per worker to replace somebody. Now, again, is this your experience again, Bhavna? Is this what you're seeing? Is this and to bring in a second question actually, which is about agency staff? Are we expecting there to be a huge rush on agency staff come November?
Well, we've got a double whammy. So when we're going over to ask for agency staff to cover existing staff at this current stage, we haven't even hit the November deadline. We've got agencies, people saying, actually, have your people been vaccinated? Have your residents been vaccinated? Unfortunately, we can't send our staff in there if they're not. So we're going to have that element coming in. I think we are in for I think it's a rocky ride. I think being prepared for the worst is always good, but I also am nervous because I don't know how it'll pan out. I don't know what the regulator's going to be doing. So we've got lots of unknowns. We hope the regulator's going to behave reasonably. We hope that staff are going to be okay. We know, I've just had a colleague text to say about pregnant women, and I know there's a question coming up about pregnant women. So again, we've got all of those things coming together. We are on really uncharted territories. We are all going to have to work together for that. But I come back to it. We have a greater responsibility to provide care for vulnerable people who are in the care facility, care services, care homes. We have no option but to provide those care. Hopefully staff will start having themselves vaccinated. But if they don't, then we have no option but to sack them. If we sack them, they will go and work at dom-care agency or whatever, because the government's not joined that up yet.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like, it's a nightmare scenario.
And similarly, and I know you've got some insight in here as well, that one question is really about whether this stops at care homes or whether it's going to extend. And I know there's talk already of a consultation with the NHS. Do you see it? Do you see it being rolled out to the NHS? Do you see it being rolled out beyond?
It's got to. It doesn't make sense. I mean, I despair sometimes at our leadership or the vacuum, you know, there is. I don't understand the logic behind it. You're going for this. You should have just gone and said, okay, we've just got to have everyone vaccinated unless you're exempted. And I know GPs are resistive to providing supporting letters saying that people are exempt, but it's got to be the staff responsibility to provide the evidence. You cannot chase. You can support, but you cannot chase. So I just think that government's been really woefully yet again lacking.
And I just want to pause on that as well, because whilst I've got you, and we're on a roll, the point about the NHS is a lot again, a number of my clients have said that the risk is that when we're mandating a vaccine and the NHS isn't, we're just going to push a load of people back to the NHS, is often where they came from in the first place. If there is going to be a mandatory vaccine for the NHS, that needs to be announced before November.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not rockets. I do get so frustrated about this. I just think that, so my other hat as the advisor to International Care Ethics Observatory, I think ethically what's happening is awful. We've just letting people down left, right and center. We've worked as a sector, we have worked so hard, and what we've achieved in spite of the obstacles is amazing. I am so proud to be part of this sector. And now we are having to be made to sack people because the government's got it slightly back to front.
Yeah.
I think we will see everyone will be vaccinated. It's got to happen. And then, of course, we'll have the flu vaccinations. All of that's going to come through. So I think we will see it. It's just they haven't seen the fuller picture, unfortunately.
Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to rattle through a few of these questions, if I may. And so the first one's actually, you've already alluded to it, about pregnancy. I think I'm going to bring Tom in for this, if I may, which is, there's a suggestion that pregnant women are not exempt, and certainly according to the sort of the guidance that we've seen so far, that is the case, unless there is a clinical or medical exemption. Now, what about pregnant women who don't want the vaccine until after they've given birth, and even some who are extending it sort of whilst they're breastfeeding, and concerns about that? Well, they may well lose their jobs. How will this sort of affect their maternity? And on the second part of this, how does this conflict with sort of other pieces of legislation?
Well, I think that, again, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because we're being asked as a sector to implement a law where some people are exempt, but there isn't full guidance on who that might be yet. And there isn't full guidance on whether it applies to pregnant women, and if so, in what situations. And so all we can do is work with the tools that we're given at the moment. And what that says is that unless you're exempt, you have to have both vaccinations, and you won't be able to enter a premises if you can't evidence that. And so it's very tricky with pregnant women, but as based on what we've got at the moment, unless they're medically exempt, then the law applies to them. And yeah, talking about the discrimination angle, which I think was kind of what you were hinting at with one of those questions there, Kevin, was to a certain extent, the discrimination problem has been taken out of employers' hands here, because it's a mandatory policy that we're having to implement as a sector, and therefore we're not deciding to say that people are required to be vaccinated. And so as long as you're operating the policy in a non-discriminatory way, then the risk around discrimination is minimal. And one example might be if you've got 5 people who are refusing to have the vaccine and you can redeploy one of them. How do you approach that situation? You've got to make sure that you're not treating people less favourably as a result of a protected characteristic. And in that situation, you might decide to adopt a scoring exercise similar to a redundancy process. And as long as you're keeping those big picture discrimination issues at the forefront of your mind, ensuring consistency of approach regardless of protected characteristics, then, and you're implementing the law with that in mind, then to a certain extent the discrimination angle falls away because the government has decided to legislate.
And for time purposes, thank you, that's an excellent answer. And for time purposes, we're not going to talk about judicial reviews today, but they may well be on the way. And finally, just to wrap up, one is, it's on the face of it a very simple question, but it seems that in practice it's not, which is around evidencing sort of vaccine status. And 2 questions on this, which we'll tackle together, which is, people are going to the GPs and they're coming back and saying, well, the GP said that I do have an exemption, but they're not prepared, or they won't write a letter to confirm it. Now, I think from again, Dan, Bhavna maybe to confirm this, but from an evidence point of view, from a regulatory point of view, I don't think the GP says it's fine is going to be enough. No. And on the second point, because I'm again time-wise, which is, I'll just read the question, which is evidencing vaccination status via the COVID passport. All it gives is a green tick, no details of what vaccine has been given and when the vaccine was given. Is this enough in terms of evidence? And I've not done it myself, so I'm gonna have to throw over to somebody else to talk about that. Dan, probably to start with.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the GP point, and I think Bhavna touched on this earlier. The duty would be on the employee to provide that evidence of a medical exemption, and of course, providers would be at risk if they were to take, the word of their staff. And in the absence of any other evidence, any other supporting evidence. I think that's the problem here, and therefore it has to be the case that staff have to provide that evidence. Otherwise, as I mentioned earlier, unless it's there and unless it's recorded in some way, then CQC will say, well, it never happened.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. That is the approach that the CQC will take.
Thank you. Yeah, and just on the evidence point, one of our guests has helpfully contributed to say that the NHS app actually shows all of your vaccine data, including even the batch number. So I think
it does.
Yeah, thank you.
But also the one that you actually took with you to the hospitals or wherever you were getting your vaccination, that also, some people have laminated that. Number of care staff I know laminated it. So that has the batch number, the name, all of that. So that's evidence.
It does, but that's not efficient. That's not sufficient evidence, as I mentioned earlier, for the purposes. If you can have maybe the 2 together, and again, we don't have time now to talk about people who may be sort of creating false documents and other things, and how much you have to go through to check them. But one question is really about, particularly with people who are not employees, but those contractors, people coming in from outside, visitors, even volunteers. Should you be checking the sort of the passport against other ID as well to make sure the 2 marry up? And I think that probably is a sensible approach.
We've said anyone coming in, so we've actually said there's got to be only one entrance, so you can actually police that. And it is going to be about policing who's coming in and out, because it's that one case where something's going to go wrong and that one's going to come back and bite you. So anyone coming onto your premises who are going to be undertaking any work or whatever, you have to satisfy yourself that the evidence they're providing, so ID checks, the passport, to make sure the batch number, so on and so forth, that's all checked and contained. And, again, the data protection side kicks in there. You have to maintain that privacy side.
All right, thank you. Well, look, let's put everyone back on the screen to say farewell. That's unfortunately our hour, and people can go now and enjoy some lunch. But thank you all, first of all, to the panelists. Thank you for all the people that joined us and were asking questions. As you can see, there's no particularly straightforward answer to a lot of these things. We've got the law, we're stuck with it, we have to deal with it, we have no choice. We're still waiting for a little bit more direction, perhaps, but we can't wait. We need to start making plans now. And obviously get in touch with us. If you've got any questions specifically, we're here to help out, and we'll do what we can. So first of all, thank you again, and we'll be keeping you up to date through the emails. If you're not signed up, I'm sure you will be now, and hopefully it's not all spam. One question is, would we send out a link to the legislation? I think what we'll do is to send out possibly even a link to this video again, along with any other documents which are going to be relevant. And do keep an eye out on your emails for anything else, and when we find out about it, we'll be updating you. So thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you.